She's saying she's exhausted just because she's in her final month of pregnancy. What kind of upbringing did you give her?
Upon opening the front door, I was met by my daughter, Linda, and her husband, Thomas. Thomas complained about dust under the table and a dirty bathroom floor, blaming my upbringing for her inability to clean properly. Did he not understand that bending over with Linda's large belly was difficult? It would take time, and if it bothered him, he should just do it himself. Before I could open my mouth, Thomas had his hand on the door.
We're leaving the fat, useless one who can't do housework behind. She's just in the way.
I am Jennifer, turning 54 this year. I work for a major company. Having lost my husband early, I raised Linda by myself. Raising Linda on my own was tough, but her smile made all the fatigue disappear. Linda grew up to be kind and considerate, blessed with friends. However, she was clueless about romantic relationships and struggled to find a boyfriend. I had hoped she would introduce a boyfriend around high school, but she didn't have one even in college. After graduating, she worked as an office worker at a food manufacturer. There, too, no romantic prospects came up. Without me, Linda would be alone. Concerned, I thought about introducing her to a man through acquaintances, but then she shyly reported she was dating a man introduced by a friend. Their relationship progressed well, and about 2 years later, they announced their engagement, to my relief. Though I felt lonely about Linda leaving the nest, the reassurance that she had a family was stronger. Linda and her husband live about an hour's drive from my house. Thomas is 4 years older than Linda and very dedicated to his work. He wanted to advance and earn more, often working late or going out, leaving all the household chores to Linda. I thought that as a dual-income couple, they could share household responsibilities, but decided it was not my place to interfere and chose to listen silently. Then, about 6 months after Linda got married, she invited me to lunch and announced she was pregnant. Linda, an only child who always loved kids, often told me when she was little,
I wish I had a brother or sister.
But since I wasn't considering remarrying, I couldn't fulfill her wish. Even after getting married,
I've always wanted to have children.
Linda, who always wanted children, would caress her flat belly, saying affectionately,
I can't wait to meet you.
Seeing Linda like that made me happy too. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to contact me, I said, and that day, I parted ways with Linda. Linda kept working even after becoming pregnant, so I regularly met up with her to see her healthy. When Linda reached a stable phase in her pregnancy, I was assigned a major project that could lead to a promotion, and my business trips increased. Linda was very happy for me when I told her about it, encouraging me with,
Don't worry about me, just focus on your work.
So, I repeatedly asked Thomas to take care of Linda. Please take care of Linda. And immersed myself in work. Linda must be close to her due date by now. As the project was nearing its end and work was settling down, I called Linda to discuss preparations for after the birth. However, Thomas answered the phone.
Hello, Jennifer? Perfect timing. Linda's being useless and getting in the way, so I'm bringing her over to you. What? What do you mean?
He didn't wait for my reply and hung up. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found Thomas and an exhausted Linda standing there.
Linda!
I was shocked by Linda's changed appearance and called out to her, but she was unable to smile. Dark circles under her eyes, her hair, nails, and skin were dry, looking far from her 20s. Her fingers were cracked and bleeding. Her expression was gloomy, staring blankly and looking down. I couldn't believe she had become like this in just a few months. First, I let them in and had them sit on the sofa. Since Linda couldn't speak, I asked Thomas for an explanation.
Thomas, why is Linda in such a state?
Surprised, Thomas replied without any remorse.
You're blaming me? She got fat and clumsy, and even though housework is a woman's job, she tried to skive off by lying about feeling sick.
I glared at him, incredulous.
Thomas, you forced Linda to do housework even though she was suffering from morning sickness? Huh? Pregnancy isn't an illness. She kept asking to switch some chores because she wanted to slack off. I told her to stop being so spoiled. I'm working all day, after all. Anyway, she's just in the way at home and doesn't do any housework, so please take care of her until she gives birth.
He retorted with hostility. I realized this man had no understanding of pregnancy or childbirth and lacked the awareness of being a dad. I couldn't leave my precious daughter with such a man.
All right, I will. Thomas, you're not fit to take care of her.
Yes, I said to Thomas.
Her being spoiled is your fault, Jennifer, for raising her that way. You're a single mother who doesn't know how to serve a husband, causing trouble for me. Once the baby is born, come pick her up. Until then, please re-educate Linda, Jennifer.
With that, he left Linda behind and went away. There's a limit to looking down on people. I can't believe he was that kind of man. I regretted letting Linda marry such a man. Linda sat there, slumped over like a doll, without moving. For now, I needed to make Linda feel at ease. Thinking this, I opened the fridge, took out some milk, and made hot chocolate with a bit of sugar in Linda's favorite mug, heating it in the microwave oven.
Be careful, it's hot,
I said, handing it to Linda. Upon taking a sip of the hot chocolate, Linda began to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. I sat next to Linda, rubbed her back, and listened to her story. Thomas was ambitious about climbing the corporate ladder and had continued to attend company drinking parties even after Linda got pregnant, neglecting her. Whenever she needed something from the store, he'd tell her to handle it herself, never offering to help. When Linda was lying down, suffering from abdominal bloating.
Hey! Wake up! Always lazing around. You haven't done the dishes, nor have you finished the laundry.
She was woken up and forced to do household chores. Furthermore, it seems she was told to cook and clean up after Thomas and his colleagues who would come home from drinking parties and eat and drink until late at night. I clenched my fist in anger upon hearing that my pregnant daughter was being treated like a slave. Linda didn't want to ruin my chance for a promotion, so she endured without contacting anyone, and even had the doctor explain to Thomas about the physical changes in pregnant women, but it was to no effect. Also, since Thomas's parents lived far away, and it was not possible to visit them without flying, Linda couldn't rely on her in-laws and had to endure on her own. Linda has always put others before herself. I gently hugged Linda and said,
Linda, from now on, it's okay to prioritize yourself. It's okay to rely on those around you when you're in trouble or suffering. I'm sorry I didn't notice.
And I slowly stroked Linda's head. Mom, thank you. Linda cried like a child with sobs. A few days after Linda came to our house, as her due date approached, she became emotionally unstable. When I returned from work, the house was clean, and even though I said,
Linda, it's okay to rest,
Linda wouldn't stop doing household chores, preparing meals, or doing laundry. She even tried to hang heavy futons or climb on a chair to replace a broken light. Sometimes, she would pack her bags and attempt to leave for her home because she was afraid of making Thomas angry. I thought it would be best to consult a psychologist, so I went to ask a former therapist neighbor for recommended hospitals.
Susan, hello. I have a consultation about Linda.
Do you have a moment now? As I said this, Susan kindly invited me in and listened to my story. I talked to Susan and her husband, Matthew, about Linda and got a recommendation for a hospital. Linda, feeling her mental distress, started attending the hospital. The Susan couple cared about Linda a lot, and when I was not home due to work, Susan would come over and check on Linda, saying, "I'm a housewife now." Thanks to this, Linda gradually recovered and started to smile again like before. On the due date, when Linda started having labor pains, I took her to the hospital, comforting her by patting her back and wiping her sweat. After a while, as the intervals between labor pains became shorter, I saw Linda off to the delivery room. Sitting and waiting anxiously, I finally heard the baby's cry. Relieved by the nurse's report. Both mother and child are healthy. I went to see Linda and the baby, who was soundly sleeping in Linda's arms. Though I was angry at Thomas, I informed him that he had a healthy daughter since he was, after all, the dad. Immediately coming to the hospital room, upon seeing his child, he said, "Wow. Babies look like monkeys. Not cute at all. Linda isn't wearing makeup, and just sleeping in the hospital room is too lazy. Being a woman, you should care more about your appearance." He showered the post-delivery Linda with heartless words. When I was about to retort, the nurses and doctors who heard this became furious, surrounding Thomas and scolding. "Are you even a husband? Your wife has given birth to this child, risking her life and is utterly exhausted? Can't you say something, Kinder?" However, Thomas, looking annoyed, retorted, "Shut up! My mom was working right after giving birth. This is laziness, no matter how you look at it." It's unheard of for someone to work right after giving birth, and there's no way he remembers that. His memory must have been altered somewhere. It's understandable he wouldn't know, having no interest in pregnancy or childbirth. Angry, Thomas left and didn't come on the day Linda was discharged, nor did he seem to intend to pick her up. I was apprehensive about sending Linda back to Thomas, so I told her, "You can stay here if you like." Linda wished to return home, saying, "It's sad for the child to be without a dad." Reluctantly, I called Thomas to see if he was not coming to pick her up. "I'm busy with work, so please take care of things over there. I can't afford to lose sleep over the baby crying at night," he said before hanging up the phone immediately. To Linda, I said, "Let's live at home until you get used to parenting," and took Linda back home. Since we hadn't bought things like a baby crib yet, we rushed to buy the necessary items and set up an environment for raising a child. Thomas didn't think about the baby's name, prioritizing work, so Linda and I decided on the name. We named the baby Emily. Our neighbors, Susan and her husband, also helped with raising Emily, knowing the situation, and Emily grew up healthy. One day, about 3 months after Emily was born, Thomas came to pick up Linda and Emily without any prior notice. "Hey! I've come to pick you up. Hurry up and get ready." As insensitive as ever, Thomas yelled from the entrance. By that time, Linda's mental state, which had been unstable after giving birth, had temporarily stabilized, and she fully understood that Thomas's attitude was appalling. Linda had decided to divorce, having no intention of returning to Thomas. Through the door, Linda retorted, "I won't be ordered around by Thomas anymore, and I'm not coming back home. I'll send the divorce papers, so sign them." But he screamed back, refusing to agree to a divorce. "Don't joke with me. In today's world, it's easier to get ahead if you have a wife and a child. If we divorce, what was the point of marrying you and having a child? I'll never agree to a divorce." Refusing to agree to a divorce. Linda boiled with rage, thinking that this man married her and had her bear a child just for his career advancement. Before I could yell back, the door next to us opened. Hearing Thomas's yelling, our neighbors, Susan and her husband, came out of their house. Thomas, who had merely glanced at Susan, turned pale when Matthew came out.
Manager? Why are you here?
Thomas muttered in astonishment as Susan and others walked towards him. It was then I first learned that Matthew was Thomas's boss. Matthew, surprised to see Thomas, said,
Thomas is Linda's husband. I wondered what kind of man could neglect his wife and leave his newborn child for 3 months, and it turns out to be Thomas. You lack compassion. I can't entrust subordinates to someone like you. I'll report this to the president, and forget about any promotion.
With a puzzled expression and in a low voice to Thomas.
Please, manager. Think it over.
Thomas begged, crying and clinging to Matthew, who firmly replied.
There's nothing more to say to Thomas. I'm not interested in hearing more. Thomas, you really only think about work.
Matthew refused to hear any more. All my efforts until now, what were they for? Thomas slumped in defeat. Matthew, known in the neighborhood and at work as a loving husband, couldn't tolerate Thomas treating his wife and family like tools for his career. It seems there had been talk of a promotion for Thomas at work because he had always shown a good face at the company. Thomas quietly went home that day, but after going to work, he began bothering his colleagues and subordinates.
Hey, you've eaten at my place, right? Can't you speak to the manager to help me get promoted?
And when no one moved to help, he went to speak directly to the president.
President, I've been working hard for this company every day. I've kept my sales performance at the top. Please acknowledge my promotion. The manager told me about you. Your performance might look excellent on paper. But I've looked into the details, and it seems you've been quite forceful in securing deals. It's not enough just to improve your own performance. Deals that tarnish the company's image are a net negative, even if they result in a contract. You can't aim for the top without considering these things. I have no more expectations of you,
the president said, leaving Thomas pale and dejected as he left the president's office. The president of Thomas's company, occasionally appearing on TV, is known as a person of character. The decision was made not just on the manager's information but after the president himself gathered information, determining Thomas was not suitable for higher positions. This must have been communicated to Thomas. Afterward, Thomas lost his motivation for work, made too many mistakes, and caused too much trouble, resulting in his demotion to a department in the countryside with almost no work. It was probably a relief he wasn't fired. After being demoted, Thomas said,
Linda, I was wrong. I want to start over. Please let me see Emily. I'm Emily's dad, aren't I?
Thomas started coming over repeatedly, saying, I want to make things right with Linda. I want to see Emily. Saying. Thinking it was too late, both Linda and I ignored Thomas due to his persistence. However, after consulting Matthew and receiving a final warning that he'd be fired if he continued to bother us, Thomas disappeared. It seems that was all the consideration he had. After learning Linda was struggling to get a divorce accepted, Matthew introduced her to an excellent lawyer, and the divorce was finalized smoothly, including claims for mental anguish. Thomas was demoted and now lives a quiet life alone in Philadelphia. This is what I heard from Matthew, but when Thomas showed his face at the headquarters, his shirt and suit were wrinkled, he had grown a stubble, and he had become thin, hardly resembling his former self. In Philadelphia, where Thomas was demoted, it's hard to stop by a cleaner or convenience store without a car. Whether he's saving on fuel costs or just finds it troublesome, if he doesn't use these services, he has to manage everything on his own. Since he claimed household chores were a woman's job and never helped, he probably can't do anything by himself now. It would be good if he regretted treating Linda like a slave there. Thomas might think he has lost everything after the divorce and losing custody. He started forgetting to pay child support for Emily, which was supposed to be split. When Linda calls to remind him, he apparently cries about his difficult situation. I told Linda to leave it to the lawyer, and after the lawyer demanded the child support, it was paid promptly. So far, there's been no word from Thomas wanting to see Emily. If Emily wishes, we plan to contact him, but Linda and I nodded in agreement that we would raise her to be a fine adult full of love, even without a dad.
I always wanted to do the cake cutting at my wedding.
My sister-in-law, Karen, who wore the same dress as me, said this. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, with me as the main character. The wedding dress was a high-end brand that took time to choose. Not only could I not forgive her for wearing the same dress, but Karen was also trying to take the cake cutting from me. All I could do was stand there in shock. My name is Lisa. I'm a 30-year-old office worker. I always had a strong desire to marry but struggled to find the right partner, so I frequented a marriage agency. There, I met Brian, a man a year older than me, and we hit it off over our shared interest in watching soccer. We started going to soccer games and dining out together, and it naturally progressed into a relationship. Being with Brian always made me smile, and discussing soccer was enjoyable, so I hoped to marry him someday. Even though I had been introduced to several men through the agency before meeting Brian, none of them felt right. Brian has an older sister named Karen. Brian cherishes Karen a lot, and I happened to meet her a few times during our dates. Karen, 3 years older than Brian at 34, seemed like a bright and friendly person. From the first meeting, she bombarded me with questions while laughing, making me feel welcomed as Brian's girlfriend. However, her taste in wearing very short miniskirts and crop tops didn't quite match mine, which was a bit disappointing. Brian and Karen appeared very close, caring deeply for each other, which was evident even to an outsider. One day, a colleague asked if I could take a soccer match ticket they had won in a magazine raffle. Since Brian and I already had tickets, I politely declined but accepted it after being told to give it to someone else. While I was pondering who to give it to, Brian asked,
Karen has been wanting to watch a soccer game for a while. Do you mind if I take her?
I happily agreed. Karen was interested in soccer but had never experienced a live game. I thought this could be a chance to get closer to Karen. Thinking it would be best to get along with my future sister-in-law, I hoped for a good relationship. On the day, Karen appeared in her usual flashy attire and initially supported us enthusiastically. However, perhaps tired from the long game, she soon stopped watching and started fiddling with her mobile phone. After a while of silent phone usage, perhaps bored, she began to continuously talk to Brian, and before we knew it, the first half of the game ended.
Is the first half finally over? Watching the second half is going to be tough. I'm going home,
Karen said languidly and stood up. Then Brian said, as if it was the most natural thing, "If that's the case, I'll drive you home."
Wait, you're driving her? Can't she go home by herself?
Leaving me internally wondering. Feeling uneasy as Brian took Karen home, I watched the game alone with a mix of emotions. As Brian didn't return for a while, I worried something had happened until I received a message from him saying,
Karen's not feeling well, taking her to the hospital.
Realizing her behavior might have been due to feeling unwell, I became concerned for Karen.
Is Karen okay? Make sure to take good care of her at the hospital,
I texted Brian. Despite looking forward to watching the soccer game together, I felt lonely watching it alone, but understood it couldn't be helped if Karen was feeling unwell, convincing myself to be okay with it. Later, Brian proposed to me, and we decided to get married. Initially, Karen congratulated us on our marriage, but gradually, she started to look down on me. "You always look so plain. You have no style. Lisa, you're kind of dreary, you know," she said blatantly, and Brian began to take her side, treating me harshly. Previously, this had never been the case, but Brian started picking on me and making sarcastic comments, leaving me utterly confused. However, as we had already introduced each other to our parents and relatives, it was too late to back out. Hoping that our life together would return Brian to his kind self after our upcoming wedding, I endured. We were still living with our parents but had decided to move in together after the wedding. Having always dreamed of my wedding, I spent a lot of time choosing my wedding dress. Brian helped me try on many dresses. Even Brian, who had been acting more dominantly, sincerely helped me choose the dress. For this once-in-a-lifetime event, I splurged on a high-end brand wedding dress. On the wedding day, surrounded by family and friends, I was showered with compliments on my dress. As I savored my happiness, Karen made her entrance. To my utter shock, Karen was wearing the exact same wedding dress as me.
"What, Karen, why?"
I managed to utter, to which Karen sneered. "See? I look beautiful, right? It was so hard to get this dress." Karen had gone out of her way to find the exact same dress from a sister company's dress shop. The sight of another woman wearing a white dress, identical to the bride's, at a wedding created a bizarre scene, prompting murmurs of contempt from the guests. Yet, Karen remained unabashed, claiming, "Brian will be happier seeing me dressed up."
"What is this person talking about?"
Bewildered, I turned to Brian, only to see him smiling happily. Brian declared, "I've always thought that dress suits Karen better than Lisa," creating a tense atmosphere in the venue. Karen gleefully said,
"I knew Brian would say that." "Brian, are you serious?"
I asked, to which he replied,
"Of course. Even when choosing your dress, I was always thinking about which one would suit Karen."
So, that was the reason he was so involved in the dress selection. I regretted marrying such a man, surpassing anger to sheer disbelief. The staff, obviously noticing the commotion, seemed unable to forcibly remove Karen given she was the groom's sister. They offered her several alternative colored dresses to change into, but Karen outright refused. As the reception progressed, it was time for the cake cutting. Trying to prepare myself amidst unresolved feelings, Karen suddenly broke away from the staff. Karen declared as she grabbed the cake knife,
"I always wanted to do the cake cutting too. Brian would be happier doing it with me."
I protested.
"What are you doing? This is outrageous."
But Karen ignored me, calling out,
"Come on, Brian, join me."
Could he really be joining her? Apprehensively, I looked towards Brian to find him, yet again, looking delighted and obediently going to Karen's side. Brian, holding the cake knife with Karen. They smiled at each other and actually proceeded to cut the cake. Overwhelmed by shock, I froze for a moment until the guests' sighs and jeers snapped me back to reality. My in-laws were yelling,
"What are you two doing?"
Faced with their overly inappropriate behavior, my feelings cooled to the point of absurdity, leading me to leave the wedding venue with my parents. Without saying a word to Brian, I returned to my parents' home. Later, despite being condemned by our relatives, Brian and Karen showed no remorse, nor did they apologize to me. Even after being scolded by my in-laws, it seemed to have no effect on them. Brian even wondered,
"Why did Lisa leave midway? Getting angry over wearing the same dress or us doing the cake cutting, isn't that narrow-minded?"
Karen added,
Exactly. Why should we get scolded? There's nothing wrong with a brother and sister being close.
Brian even lamented.
It's sad that you're as disliked by Lisa.
Hearing this from my in-laws, I decided on divorce. I went to the city hall for divorce papers, contemplating confronting Brian directly but decided against seeing his face again and opted to send the documents. A few days after the divorce papers arrived, Brian called, yelling,
What's this about? Why do we have to divorce?
I responded with disbelief. Why? Brian, you still don't understand. Karen's behavior, wearing the bride's wedding dress and even taking part in the cake cutting, is beyond inappropriate. Brian retorted.
Why speak ill of Karen? Forgive her for that.
I calmly stated. That's the problem. I'm appalled by your behavior more than Karen's, and my affection for you has completely withered. You've always cared more about Karen than me. Brian argued.
What's wrong with valuing my sister? It's not normal to divorce over such things.
So, I ended the call, saying,
It's useless talking to you, Brian. Just sign the divorce papers and send them back quickly.
Caring for siblings isn't wrong, but Brian's actions were excessive. He completely failed to understand, leaving divorce as the only option. My in-laws apologized deeply to my parents and me, but I harbored no resentment towards them. Brian and Karen were to blame. I should have recognized Brian and Karen's abnormality sooner. Reflecting on our soccer game outing, I should have questioned Brian's actions earlier. Karen's behavior during the game was far from commendable, but Brian never reprimanded her, and his readiness to take her home was, in hindsight, peculiar. If only I had reconsidered and ended things sooner. It's too late to say this now. Days later, the divorce papers signed by Brian were returned. Brian seemed to have complained for a while, but the in-laws persuaded him and had him sign. The in-laws, upset that Brian and Karen had ruined the wedding, covered the wedding expenses. And they had already paid the deposit for the house we were supposed to live in after the wedding, but they compensated for that too, so I decided to have nothing more to do with those two from now on. I thought about claiming compensation in the divorce trial, but I just didn't want anything to do with them anymore, so I decided against it. Afterward, Brian and Karen were kicked out by the in-laws and decided to live together. However, Karen lacked the motivation to work and was reckless with money, so their life soon became difficult. Brian gently suggested that Karen try to save a little more, but she wouldn't listen. Feeling that they were running out of money, Brian decided to return to his parents' house for help. But the in-laws, furious with Brian and Karen, told them,
You guys, enough with the jokes. You're too selfish.
And they were never allowed back in the house. Unable to rely on anyone, the two of them were forced into poverty, but Karen still refused to work, leaving only Brian to work. However, Brian's unreasonable behavior at the wedding had spread throughout his company, making him feel very out of place. He was looked down upon by everyone.
Sister complex. Preferring his sister over his bride is unbelievable.
Whispered among themselves, and unable to bear it, Brian finally decided to quit. Finding a new job was tough, and the company he finally got hired at was hardly great, making him work hard every day. Moreover, his salary was significantly lower than at his previous job, so even Karen started a part-time job, but she was fired soon after for not showing up without notice. She found another part-time job but was fired again for the same reason. From then on, Brian and Karen started arguing more than ever. Brian, stressed from work and the lack of money, and irritated by Karen's constant firing from part-time jobs, began to take it out harshly on Karen. Karen, surprised by her brother's drastic change but being naturally spirited, sometimes got into physical fights with Brian. Eventually, they stopped living together. Brian was left to live a lonely life, while Karen ended up working at a nightclub. Struggling with the unfamiliar job, Karen was physically and mentally exhausted. On the other hand, I was initially down after the divorce, but with the help of those around me, I managed to recover surprisingly quickly. Brian called and emailed several times wanting to get back together, but I ignored all of them. Eventually, I blocked his number, cutting off all contact. I was worried for a while that Brian might come to my house, but fortunately, he never did. A few months passed, and I thought less and less about Brian and his sister, starting a relationship with a sincere man I met through a friend. Now, I'm living with him, and we're planning to marry next year. His family is also wonderful. Unlike Brian, he prioritizes and cherishes me, allowing me to live a calm and peaceful life. I'm truly glad I left Brian. Just thinking about starting a life with Brian sends shivers down my spine. Glad to have left him early. I've resolved to be absolutely happy and am enjoying my days, looking forward to a bright future.